Thanks to Shopify for supporting Future Hindsight. Shopify is a platform designed for anyone to sell anywhere, giving entrepreneurs like us the resources once reserved for big business. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/hopeful, all lowercase. Welcome to Future Hindsight, a podcast that takes big ideas about civic life and democracy and turns them into action items for you and me. I'm Mila Atmos. It's 2024, and the future of America is in your hands. Democracy is not a spectator sport, so we're here to bring you an independent perspective about the election this year and empower you to change the status quo. We say this all the time, state and local level is where the action is. And today we'll be talking about policymaking at that level. Democracy is legitimate when it delivers, so our discussion will center the policies that will help government deliver and, in a way, make democracy come to life. Our guest is Debbie Cox Bultan. She's the CEO of the NewDEAL network of 150 rising state and local officials and the NewDEAL Forum, which identifies and promotes innovative state and local pro-growth progressive policies. Welcome, Debbie. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
So you are, in fact, the founder of the NewDEAL. What does the NewDEAL do, and how does it help deliver good governance?
Well, I'm a co-founder of NewDEAL, and we're very proud of what we've been doing for the last 14 years, which is to identify and then help support really exceptional state and local elected officials all over the country that are below the level of governor. So we have mayors and state legislators and city council members. And the idea when we started 14 years ago is that if we could identify those people who were particularly effective, impactful leaders on the ground and support them as they governed, as they rose up the ranks. They would both be helping people where they lived now, but also as they rose up the ranks to become governors and members of Congress, which many of our leaders have done, would be supporting people who were going to be able to solve our country's problems. And that was the vision, and that's what we do every day.
Yeah, tell us a little bit more about how you do that work.
Yeah.
So you don't work on electing them, which is great. I love that you're elevating people that are already doing the good work. So tell us a little bit how your work looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you saying that because I have worked on campaigns in my life. But, to me, campaigns were always about electing the person so that they could then govern, right? So there's this idea that if we just elect the right people, everything will work out and that, that somehow magically they know how to govern. And, we don't think of that for other people, like, say, CEOs, right? Or other people who have networks around them where they can share ideas, where they can bounce ideas off of, where they get support. We assume that once you're in that leadership position, you're going to have that kind of support to help you do your job. And that's not always what most people think about elected officials, but that's how we think about it. So we do a number of things to help them, as I said, govern where they live. A lot of it is idea sharing and bringing people together. We have a large national ecosystem of think tanks and other thought leaders from the public and private sector, philanthropy, that maybe say you're a city councilwoman from Lincoln, Nebraska, that you might not be able to access. You have an idea that you're like, hey, I think I want to do something on financial literacy or whatever it is. Who in our network, Debbie, could I talk to that could help me do that? So to try to bring a whole host of resources and ideas and support to those elected officials as they're governing is what we do. We do it through convenings. You mentioned our NewDEAL Forum, which has a number of ongoing policy working groups on things like climate and education and AI now and democracy. So we do kind of ongoing throughout the year this sense of bringing people together, sharing their best ideas, elevating their voices, and then allowing them to take ideas back, whether it's in-person convenings or virtual. And then another thing we do is just support them as elected officials. It's really hard to be an elected official right now. I mean, I've been doing this work for 30 years. I've never seen anything like it. We have leaders who have had death threats over the mask mandates, credible kidnapping charges against them. And so I would say more recently, my job has also become just to support these folks and to say, we've got your back. There are other people going through this, be a place where they can come and hopefully keep them in the game, because it's really important that we have really good leaders. I mean, that's really what democracy is founded on, right? As I like to say, they're the by the people and the we the people, for the people, by the people. Our politicians, our elected officials are the by the people. So we need to support them. And it's a divisive politics we have right now. It's hard to be in that job sometimes.
Yeah, it sounds like you do a lot of things well beyond helping them think about policy making, how to connect to the resources to execute on that policy if they can, how to find the funding, but also just the emotional support in this time. It's so difficult. And it sounds like you do basically some executive coaching in addition to everything else.
I think that's right. We try to be a support across the board, and we're just coming off a big convening we do every year and called our Spring Ideas Summit. We were in Phoenix last week and, had 50 of them with us. And, as I was saying at the top of that event, I was hoping this could be a place where they could take a breath, remember why they do this, and then, then roll up our sleeves and get around the table and talk about literally water policy and AI and climate, and so it's a little bit of everything, as you say.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I have a question about policymaking and, electing people. Like you said, we have this idea, we're going to elect good people and then they're just going to figure it out, or they already know how. And I think there's also this idea that policymaking in and of itself is not really the problem. It's really the execution of the policy, like you said, the governing. Mm-hmm. What have you learned over these last 30 years about the inner workings of government?
That's an interesting question. I would say probably a number of things, but I might start with the fact that it's messy. It's hard, but that's how our founders intended it, right? And so, I think one of the disconnects we have right now actually is around this idea that we want everybody to get stuff done, but at the same time, there's really different ideas about how we should go about doing things, what we believe on different sides of the aisle or on different sides of any policy debate. And so, government works best when there is compromise, when there is coming together and finding common ground, right? That's what actually it takes to govern. And when I was starting out, that was what I saw. I saw that there was a governing season and then there was a campaign season. And then when the campaign season was over, you went back to governing and you kind of put all of those things aside. And then you started to do what was right for the country and figure out how we were going to come together and pass a bill. And that's really changed in my time in politics, right? There really is no off button on the campaign season. And so your listeners will know this, but you hear things coming out of elected officials' mouths about we're not going to give the other party a legislative win because they can then go ahead and use that in a campaign. That's not how we're supposed to govern. That's one of the interesting and frustrating and also, I think, important things for people to understand, which is, I think there's a lot of, this is a huge topic, right? We could talk about redistricting and the fact that we don't really have competitive elections anymore. So the incentives are not to go to the center, but to go to the extremes. We have 24-hour media cycles where people have to fill airtime. And so the loudest voices, not often the most common sense voices, get the most airtime. So there's a lot of factors that go into this. But I think that the important thing is we've got to get back to a place where we understand that to govern means to come together, put your differences aside, find common ground, and work together, right? The other thing that frustrates me so much is that there's this idea that if someone's not with you, they're against you, that they're somehow a bad person, that they're somehow on the other team. I'm also old enough to remember when different coalitions would come together. So maybe, rural Democrats, rural Republicans would come together from different states to be together on a farm bill, right? But they may not be together on a different issue. And so there was this idea that you would see where you had common ground with people that you worked with and come together to pass that legislation. Then a different coalition might form around a different set of ideas or legislation. And again, we've kind of built this wall that says, no, I'm going to stay on my team. And anybody who's not on my team is the enemy, and my job is to actually tear them down, not let them get a win. And that's really a hindrance to actually governing effectively.
Yeah, that's so true. Everything is so black and white now. And I was talking to somebody about this recently, and I said, no, the whole idea is that you're going to disagree on things, and you're going to find a way to work together to pass the legislation or work together, whatever it is that you're working on, to find something that resolves the problem for everybody in the collective, whatever the collective is.
That's right.
There are some divisions among parties, right? It's not just Republicans against Democrats, and we're talking about the political parties. And you use the word progressive in your mission statement. So for some people, that's too far left. And I kind of feel like it's been overused. And I think it's not clear what people mean anymore necessarily, just like liberal has been overused or maybe inaccurately used. So let's unpack that a little bit. What does progressive mean to you at New Deal? And what are the values that you're centering in the policies that you lift up?
Yeah. So we are very distinctly pro-growth progressive, which is distinctive than just progressive because we kind of squarely see ourselves in the center-left, common sense part of the Democratic Party. And so to me, what does that mean? It kind of means what we were talking about. It means that, if you think about who we're going to choose to invite to join New Deal, that's how you become a New Deal leader. You're invited to join. So what are the qualities or criteria we're looking at for people to join New Deal? We're looking for people who are problem solvers, not flamethrowers. We're looking for people who are willing to work across the aisle when there's common ground, that are really trying to put results first. We are squarely in the Democratic camp. I have been a Democrat for 30 years. It's because I think that historically our party has been the party about trying to create opportunity for all people and to lift everyone up. And so that's why I am a progressive in the pro-growth progressive. But I also don't believe that government can solve every problem. And I'm not looking for big government solutions. I'm looking for public-private partnerships and creative ways to solve problems. And I try not to be too attached to any single program, even if it's been a Democratic stalwart of a program. I think we've got to look at things and say, is it working the way we intended? Is delivering the results? And let's be kind of relentlessly innovative and relentlessly practical and pragmatic about solving problems. We just did a poll as part of this event that we just did in Phoenix. And we're asking people both about freedom and about democracy, but also about what qualities they were looking for in leaders. And for the second year in a row, not surprisingly, overwhelmingly, people said they wanted people who get things done. And I think this idea that we have to pick sides, that we have to be the loudest, most extreme voice to get attention, I think that's really an anathema to what it takes to govern. And so we're looking for those people who are kind of not doing that, who are, not looking for likes or tweets and retweets. They're looking for results.
Yeah, for sure. Getting things done, I think, as I mentioned in the intro, makes democracy legitimate, right? Like if government is working, then people trust, they have faith that the system works. I think it's very important.
Yeah, well, and can I say one thing on that point? Because
I
think you're exactly right, and I'm sure I'm not the only person, but one of the people on a mission right now to talk about the fact that government can do good things. Because I do think that part of what is the problem with our democracy right now is that people believe that government is the problem, government is the enemy, the politicians are all somehow corrupt or in it for themselves. And I think that that's actually not an accident, sadly. I think that that's been by design for decades now. Remember Ronald Reagan famously saying that, government is the enemy. I think that that's been a talking point for a long time. And even people who believe in the government can solve problems like I do sometimes fell into that trap of talking about, well, we're going to somehow push off government to talk about how we can do things well. And I think for all of us who are worried and care about democracy, we have to understand that you can't separate democracy from the people who practice it and the government that democracy then elects to do our business. That doesn't mean we can't disagree on the size and scope of government. I would love to be having those quaint conversations again that we used to have. Like, what's the right tax structure? Instead of, are we going to tear everything down? Or are we going to build it up? And so I think we've got to change our language around government and politicians. And that will help us in our fight to kind of restore faith in democracy, to know the government can deliver for the American people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I totally agree. And I also like what you're saying about rejecting the frame that government is the problem instead of accepting it and then having conversations in that field because you're not going to get out of it. It just is not going to work. I want to turn to the policy working groups that you have because I would love to talk about the ideas that you have floating around that we mentioned in the beginning. And you have so many policy working groups, including the Democracy Working Group, the Climate Policy Group, Broadband Task Force, the Education Policy Group, and the Future of Work. And since we are a pro-democracy podcast, let's dig in first into the Democracy Working Group. It recently published the Democracy Playbook. What are your main takeaways, especially in light of this being an election year?
So I will start by saying that the Democracy Working Group is one of our more recent ones that we stood up. And it was important to me after January 6th to really figure out what New Deal's value add could be in the democracy conversation. So we went back to what we do best, which is, we are a network of really thoughtful, smart state and local elected officials around the country. And what we do is we find best practices that they're working on and try to elevate them amongst the group itself, but then even more broadly to other practitioners, elected officials, thought leaders. And so we launched this Democracy Working Group with co-chairs that included the Secretary of State of Michigan, Jocelyn Benson, Secretary of State of Arizona, Adrian Fontes, fantastic Nevada Assemblywoman, Sandra Horigi, County Commissioner in Pennsylvania, Ken Lawrence, all of whom were on the front lines of governing around democracy issues. The good news is that, in the 2020 election, democracy held, but we saw a lot of the vulnerabilities, of course, right? And where things could be exploited or attacked. And then we knew that these threats were going to be ongoing, which we've certainly seen. And so our idea was that we were going to talk about what were some of the best practices that we could put in place for kind of in three big buckets. One was on voting specifically, things like how to make it easier to vote and to expand access to the ballot. So that's everything from things like, are you doing same-day registration in your state? What are you thinking about your Dropbox hours? Where are they going? Are they in places where people maybe historically have not had transportation to get to the polls? So can you put a Dropbox that's a little bit closer? So then we had a whole section around election integrity, which I think is also super important. We did that poll I mentioned in Arizona recently, and it was very interesting. It sounds like both Democrats and Republicans are both very concerned about democracy, but for different reasons, right? So Democrats tend to like to talk about things like access to the ballot and making sure everyone's vote can be cast and then is going to be counted, which is absolutely paramount. Republicans tend to talk about the fact they're worried about security and the process. And so we have a lot of good ideas in the democracy playbook around things like transparency. Another Secretary of State who's a New Deal leader is Steve Simon in Minnesota, and he publicly tests every election machine every year for the press to come in and show that it's working and, to try to rebuild that trust in the election system. Also, a huge thing that's under that bucket has been around protecting poll workers. Something that was relatively new for us, unfortunately, was this kind of harassment and intimidation of poll workers. So we've seen a lot of legislation around the country, including Michigan, who's been a leader on this, to make that a crime to threaten or harass or intimidate poll workers. And then the last piece of the democracy playbook is thinking a little bit longer term about civic engagement. And there's some really good ideas around thinking about having young people be poll workers or making sure high schools allow for time off if kids want to engage in civic experiences, whether that's a protest or working on a campaign or whatever it is. So there's more than 40 ideas in there that we put together with a timeline of thinking about 2 years out for the next election, 1 year out from the next election. And we've been really gratified and excited to see so many of those ideas taken and run with from people all over the country who've been doing really great work.
Amazing. So much information there. I'm very impressed that you can rattle this all off like, the tip of your tongue. Very impressive.
Thank you.
Just as an aside for the listener, we did have Jocelyn Benson, Secretary of State for Michigan, on the podcast in 2022, and we talked about election integrity. That was a fascinating conversation. I encourage everyone to go back and listen to that.
She's amazing.
We're taking a short break to hear about our sponsor, Shopify, and we'll be back in a moment. But first, Socrates and Plato, Chewbacca and Han Solo. What about the perfect duo when it comes to growing your business? That's you and Shopify. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business, from the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit 1 million orders stage? Shopify is there to help you grow. Whether you're selling sandboxes or offering original ornaments, Shopify helps you sell everywhere. You heard that right. From their all-in-one e-commerce platform to their in-person POS system, wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify has got you covered. Shopify also helps you turn browsers into buyers with the internet's best converting checkout. 36% better on average compared to other leading commerce platforms. Sell more with less effort thanks to Shopify Magic, your AI-powered all-star. Shopify powers 10% of all e-commerce in the U.S. It's the global force behind Allbirds, Rothy's, and Brooklinen, and millions of other entrepreneurs of every size across 175 countries. Plus, Shopify's award-winning help is there to support your success every step of the way, because businesses that grow with Shopify. What I love about Shopify is how no matter how big you want to grow, Shopify gives you everything you need to take control and take your business to the next level. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/hopeful, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/hopeful now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/hopeful. And now, let's return to my conversation. You mentioned that you also advocate for civic engagement. I like the ideas in engaging young people, because one of the questions I had was, you can't really legislate civic engagement. You can't mandate people participate. You've been in this space for 30 years. What are ways where you feel like this is the thing that consistently gets people excited about taking part in democracy?
Yeah, I think there is a lot that elected officials can do, whether it's legislatively or not. It's like, thinking about requiring high schools to allow for time off to work on elections, just as one example of that. We've got some related stuff that we've done over the years that I like about requiring internet literacy too, because we haven't talked yet about disinformation and misinformation, but that's obviously a huge factor in elections right now. So thinking long-term about civic engagement is also about long-term about educating our young people about how to find good information and, to be able to use their critical thinking skills to distinguish between what is accurate or not accurate information, where to get that information. There's a lot that they can do from a bully pulpit, though, too, which is also just to bring people together. At our last fall conference in Washington, D.C. in November, we had a couple experts on who talked to us about how you have difficult conversations in communities. This was with a group called the American Exchange Project, which does really great work to bring high school students to other cities that might be very different from their own. So think the foreign exchange program where you used to send people, from Los Angeles to Paris. Well, now you send people from Los Angeles to Coal Country, Kentucky, or to Appalachian Mountains. It's not very heavy-handed, but you go to a different place, you're like, hey, that's different than where I live. Why do you do things that way? Or what does that mean? And you start to have these different conversations. So I love that idea of having difficult conversations. And I think that elected officials can do that in their own community, right? They can bring people together across from different neighborhoods, from different backgrounds. And, there's a lot of our elected officials who do advisory councils on different things. So, you could think about using tools like that to bring people together and engage them in the process. I personally am a huge fan of national service, actually. So I think there is something that we could do from a federal perspective. And there's a lot of very cool state-based programs like this. I'm in California. We have a fantastic civic engagement program, California Volunteers, that has climate core, something else for college students where they can have some of their tuition reduced if they work with the state government to do things that need doing. And then New Hampshire has some really great programs around that as well, kind of like the AmeriCorps concept, but for states. But I love the idea of a mandatory national service, and that could be everything from teaching or working in a nonprofit. It's like, we have all these problems in the country that need addressing. And I do think we need to have ways where people can build community in a larger sense than what they were born and brought up with, right? Where we can work with people from different backgrounds, different places, find our commonality, find our common humanness, if you will. And so I would love to see us implement something like that nationally. I'm very heartened by how many states have kind of taken that idea up as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think the evidence across the globe is very strong that if you have a kind of national service program, whether that's, a combination of needing to do military service, or if you're against war, then you can do some sort of social service. It builds community across the country with people that you would otherwise never have an opportunity to spend quality time with. Over time, you do it for a year and you become friends with people from other states, from other backgrounds. It's a great idea, and I totally think we should do that.
In the conversation about democracy, we talk a lot about people's rights, but we don't talk as much about people's responsibilities. And so to me, it's an obligation to vote, right? I'm happen to be married to someone who it's actually from a country that's Turkey, where it's mandatory. I'm not necessarily arguing for that, but it should be instilled in us that this is a responsibility that we have as a member of a free democracy, that we have to participate. So I just really think that also changing the language a little bit around that to remind us all that with these privileges come responsibilities. And so I try to do that as well.
Yeah, hear, hear. Well, one of the aspects of the civic engagement part in your democracy playbook was to help local officials be able to interact more effectively with their constituents. Like you said, they can really take advantage of this so that the voter can feel close enough to the action and the decision making that there's more trust in government, more trust in the electeds. So if I were an elected official, what would your advice be to me?
I think that my advice would be that whether or not you were going to carry a piece of legislation, by virtue of your position, you have a lot of influence and power to change the conversation, to change the dialogue, to set the tone almost. So think about ways you can bring people together in your community to reach across differences, to engage people in solving problems. I think that that's super important. I have a podcast myself called An Honorable Profession. The idea is that politics and government is an honorable profession. I've been talking to elected leaders for years now with my co-host about what got them into politics in the first place. And it's so striking to me that so many of the leaders I work with really across the board got into politics because they wanted to solve a problem. They saw an injustice, that something happened to them that they didn't want to happen to somebody else. And these themes are like universal about why people step up and run for office. And so I think that setting the tone and the language around things like when they disagree with their opponent, modeling the behavior that we want to see in our society. It's as simple as that sounds. I think it's actually pretty hard. Elected officials can help lead the way on this, can show us a different path. We are talking at a time where there's a lot of divisions on display, particularly among Republicans right now. And I'm going to be really interested to see how the conversation evolves about calling out people who you're not comfortable with their language, right? You're not comfortable with the type of politics they say they want to practice. And that should be true for everyone, right? To basically be that model of change we want to see, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, leadership matters. And I think modeling how you want to communicate in public is really powerful. So you mentioned this already a few times. You recently held the NewDEAL Forum in Phoenix to explore 3 key elements of progress: economic expansion, broad infrastructure investments, and growth that benefits all residents. So what did you think were the most exciting ideas from the forum in Phoenix?
So we did a number of things when we were in Phoenix, but we did release this poll, which was to kind of explore what Americans were thinking about this concept of freedom and democracy. What should government be doing? And there was pretty broad agreement around things like government should be ensuring free and fair elections, right? Government should be protecting its citizens. Government should be creating opportunities and pathways for good jobs and education. I always love it when I'm reminded that I think there's actually pretty broad agreement, despite what we hear from the noisy extremes, what we want to see. People say that by pretty big margins across the board that freedom and democracy, frankly, will be things that are on their mind when they go to vote in 2024. That's important, instructive to, I think, anyone who's looking to have an agenda that pushes and promotes progress in various areas, to kind of think about those words and to frame it as freedom. We released a freedom agenda ourselves last November with a group called the New Democrat Coalition, a 100-strong member caucus in the U.S. House of Representatives. It's very ideologically aligned with us around kind of common sense problem solving. And so we released a freedom agenda where we talked about things like voting or reproductive choice as freedom, but also things like freedom to be safe in your communities from gun violence, the freedom to have a education and a path to a good job. I think that for people who are trying to talk about some of those ideas, I think framing them in freedom will be a really good thing for people to do. You asked me about kind of the conference and some of the other takeaways. For your listeners, since we're talking about democracy, I might specifically point out this panel that we did, which I thought was super fascinating. We did a panel with Secretary of State Adrian Fontes from Arizona. We had a Republican, Bill Gates, who's a county commissioner, but oversees elections in Maricopa County, and then another New Deal leader who is a young Latina woman who's phenomenal from Jefferson County, Colorado. And we were talking about kind of what lessons they learned from 2022, what's on their mind heading into 2024. They talked a lot about what they're doing to prepare for AI interference in the election. That's something that we've been focusing on a lot. We're already seeing it. Your listeners probably know that there was a robocall in the New Hampshire primary that purported to be Joe Biden's voice, telling people that don't forget if they voted in the primary, they wouldn't be able to vote in the general election, complete misinformation. And so we talked a lot at the summit about what we know we can expect and what we don't know, but we know is coming, and how to prepare for that. And so it's heartening to see a lot of the election leaders sharing information, preparing for that, trying to get ahead of it, bringing in trusted messengers, people from faith community or other community leaders, being able to talk to the people in their communities about what to look out for and making sure they have good information about elections, tabletop exercises with press, rapid response processes. There's a lot to, need to keep our eye on, but also it's just so great to hear how many people are already thinking about it and doing some really innovative things to prepare us for a good election in 2024.
Yeah. If you haven't yet, you should listen to this conversation with Audrey Tang, or watch her work. She's the Minister of Digital Affairs in Taiwan, and how they essentially strengthened the information ecosystem in Taiwan by, for example, making sure that all government sources start with, I want to say 111 or something. So if you get a text message from your public utility, it's going to start with 111, so it's a trusted source. And there are a lot of things where they also did trainings with trusted faith leaders or in schools, so that people know that this person they know has accurate information. Although it's very, very hard, of course, to combat something like a robocall pretending to be Joe Biden, who people think is a trusted source, of course.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely. That's interesting. I'm gonna listen to that, because I think there's probably things our leaders could learn from it. I mentioned Minnesota's Secretary of State Steve Simon a second ago. He has a great line about this is not new; it's just a new form. And he was reminding us all recently about, flyers that were put out in Milwaukee and I think maybe the 2016 or 12 election, where it was similarly a flyer put on someone's door saying, don't forget, if your last name is A through M, you vote on Tuesday, but if it's N through Z, you vote on Wednesday, right? And so the mis and disinformation is not new. It's the methods that they're delivered. And what is really hard sometimes, if you're not paying close attention, to discern whether it's coming from a real source or not. That's why another thing a lot of our leaders are working on is transparency, things like disclaimers if you use AI, penalties if you use AI to purposefully try to deceive voters within 90 days of an election. I think some of that legislation is going to be super important going forward.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of that. That's exciting. I feel like we talked a lot about democracy, and we talked a little bit about AI and democracy. But I'm interested in the climate policy group because, of course, it's states that regulate things like oil and gas exploration and public utilities. And with the Inflation Reduction Act incentivizing clean energy, what kind of innovative public policy should we be calling for, when we speak to our electeds? Or, what should we demand and advocate for?
Well, you mentioned the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, but it is a really interesting and exciting time to be working with state and local leaders right now because of so much of the historic investment that's coming to and through them to invest in America. It's been really exciting to see what some of our leaders have been putting that money toward. At the conference itself, we talked a lot about best uses of those federal dollars and how best to leverage those for more transformative change. One thing that a lot of our leaders are focusing on is just climate resilience. We were in Phoenix, of course. The heat was real. I live in California. The fires are real. I mean, there's really not anybody probably that is listening right now that hasn't been touched by some of the changing weather patterns. A couple of these things I'm going to say are like, littler things that can be done. And then there's some big projects that need to be done. But, things like tree canopies, it's something people don't think about a lot, but actually can really bring down heat in cities. And so we're seeing a lot of leaders do that. And the mayor of Phoenix is also working on using a different concrete for roads that is not black, that doesn't absorb the heat, but is more reflective. And actually it's shown that it can really cool down neighborhoods faster than it gets trapped in that dark asphalt. And then there's, of course, bigger things. We've done some work with other partner organizations around things like carbon capture, as well as, just thinking about how all of these things fit together, right? So a lot of our leaders have been working on things like transit-oriented development, where you're thinking about how you build in a way that puts housing near jobs, near transit options. There's lots of good things about that, but one of them is a climate impact, of course, right? To get more cars off the road, but there's also having more vibrant neighborhoods and having people closer to jobs and all those types of things. So there's exciting stuff happening. And I really do feel like cities and states have been real leaders on this. When the U.S. pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, a lot of mayors and states stepped up and said, look, we're still going to try to meet those climate goals from our jurisdiction, even if the federal government's not going to. It's been wonderful to have a president in the White House who's focused on climate so much. And this is the largest historic investment in climate and bringing down energy costs and other things in our history. So it's an exciting time to be working in climate policy right now.
Yeah, there are lots of opportunities. We talked already about civic engagement at length, but we are always looking to bolster our civic action toolkit here at Future Hindsight. What are 2 things an everyday person can do to make civic engagement with their elected officials a virtuous cycle?
I really encourage people to get involved, right? Whether that's your time, your energy, your treasure. Engage and support an elected official who's running for office or a candidate that resonates with you that you think is important. But, go to a city council meeting if there's something that's on the docket that you care about and make your voice heard. It's so easy for us to kind of say, and it's hard. They don't, one of the things elected officials need to do is, and COVID helped with this a little bit, ironically, is to make it easier for people to engage, right? It shouldn't be only from 9 to 5 when everybody's at work and I have to take work off. So, the virtual testifying, the being able to send letters in, things like that. Elected officials should make that easier. But I hope if you're not an elected official, the people will take advantage of those opportunities to make their voice heard. And I would also say, think about running for office yourself. So many people that I work with, when I talk to them and ask them what got them into this, one of my questions is always like, did you know you wanted to run for office? Most people say, no, I never thought I would run for office, actually. But something happened. Like I was unhappy with the curriculum at my kid's school and I thought we could do this better. Or I wanted this street to be fixed. It was too dangerous, and I got involved and someone said to me, why don't you run and try to fix this? And people do. And so get involved, and make their voice heard. But if they're so inclined, step up and run for office as well.
Yeah, hear, hear. So, as we are rounding out our conversation here today, looking into the future, what makes you hopeful?
I am generally a pretty optimistic person. One of the things that makes me really hopeful right now is, despite what I was talking about earlier with how hard it is to be an elected official and some of the craziness that's happening, the death threats, the online vitriol that gets hurled at them day after day, particularly women, to be honest, it's terrible. I am heartened by the fact that people are not running despite all of that. They're running because of it. And so I talk to a lot of people who say, this feels to me almost like a 9/11 moment, that I know that democracy's in trouble. I know that things are feeling like they might be going off the rails, and I'm going to step up and raise my hand and try to do it differently. I'm going to be part of the solution, not just somebody who's worried about the future. And so that gives me a lot of hope. And a lot of those people, hopefully and inspirationally, are people who come from groups who have not always been represented as well as they should be in public office. So whether that's women or people of color, and that gives me a ton of hope for the future.
Yeah, that is hopeful. Thank you very much for joining me on Future Hindsight, Debbie. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show.
Oh, likewise. Thanks so much for having me. Great to meet you.
Debbie Cox Bultan is the CEO of the NewDEAL Network and the NewDEAL Forum. Next week on Future Hindsight, we're joined by Jessica Gonzalez Rojas. She's the New York State Assembly member representing the 34th District in New York City, which encompasses the neighborhoods of Corona, East Elmhurst, Jackson Heights, and Woodside. That's next time on Future Hindsight. And before I go, first of all, thanks so much for listening. If you like this episode, you'll love what we have in store. Be sure to hit that follow button on Apple Podcasts or the subscribe button on your favorite podcast app so you'll catch all of our upcoming episodes. Thank you. Oh, and please leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. It seems like a small thing, but it can make a huge difference for an independent show like ours. It's the main way other people can find out about the show. We really appreciate your help. Thank you. This episode was produced by Zach Travis and me. Until next time, stay engaged.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,